The Allies were initially caught unprepared, believing that Japan could not muster sufficiently strong forces to attack several locations at once. The war would change that opinion. The war with the U.S. began just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 7, 1941. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The Japanese also undertook a major attempt to cripple the British Navy that was operating in the Pacific. Following these events, the Japanese launched two major offensives with the aims of taking the Malayan Peninsula and the Philippines. For the upcoming invasions, the Japanese allocated the 1st, 6th, and 14th Tank Regiments for the conquest of Malaya. The 4th and 7th Tank Regiments were ready for the campaign in the Philippines. For the conquest of Burma, the 2nd Tank Regiment was allocated. In total, the Japanese mustered some 400 tanks for these operations. Opposing the Japanese, the British and Dutch only had limited numbers of armored vehicles available by the end of 1941. These were mostly obsolete light tanks and armored cars, with some smaller numbers of M3A1 Stuarts. The American armored forces consisted of the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions, with 108 M3 tanks and 50 75mm self-propelled guns. During the conquest of Malaya, each of the three Japanese tank regiments were equipped mainly with 40 Type 97 Chihas and 12 Type 95 Hagos. In total, there were some 211 tanks. The defending British forces did not expect any major use of armor due to the extremely poor terrain and jungle. The mobility of the Japanese tanks proved their worth here, as they were able to make good progress despite the poor terrain and with the cooperation of the infantry. The Japanese tank forces made good progress, during which they were supported by bicycle units. Of the Type 95, along with the Type 97, were vital against the Indian troops, which were defending the important Alor Setar air base. The speed of the Japanese tanks wreaked havoc among the Indian troops, who were pushed back in a panicked retreat. The next Japanese attack came towards the Allied Chitra defense line. Once again, the combination of Japanese tanks and bicycle units broke the Allied lines and forced some of their units to be routed. By early January, the Japanese had reached one of the last defensive lines before the mighty city of Singapore. While the first attack was repelled, Japanese soldiers found an unguarded abandoned road leading straight to the Allied defense line. Taking advantage of this, tanks and infantry rushed in to encircle the defending forces. By the end of January, after crossing some 900 kilometers, the Japanese forces reached the suburbs of Singapore. And while the Allied defensive force numbered some 70,000 men, with the Japanese only having 30,000, after heavy fighting and some clever tactical maneuvering, the Allies finally surrendered on 15th February 1942. The Japanese tanks, like the Hago, played a great role in this operation, even though their 37mm guns proved inadequate against bunkers or fortified positions. Their mobility and ease of repair made them great psychological weapons against the Allied soldiers who thought tanks could not be used in this theater. The battle for the Philippines began on the night of the 8th and 9th of December 1941. For this operation, the Japanese had organized some 160 tanks, including a number of Hagos. The American armored force consisted of the 192nd and 194th Tank Battalions. The Japanese used around 100 tanks during the amphibious landings near Lianggen. Interestingly, the Japanese used specifically designed transport boats that had bow ramps so the tanks could just drive off and immediately engage enemies. On 22nd December, the Type 95 tanks engaged a group of 5 M3 tanks near Damortis. In the short skirmish, one M3 was knocked out, with the remaining falling back to their positions. On 31st of December, and the American M3s managed to destroy 8 Type 95 tanks. By early January 1942, the advancing Japanese tanks and infantry forces had captured Manila, where the Americans responded by moving and fortifying the Bataan Peninsula with 2 tank battalions and a bunch of infantry. The task of destroying the American defenses was given to the 65th Infantry Division, supported by some 50 tanks. The Japanese tankers proved hard-pressed, as their main guns were less effective than that of the American M3s, and they lost a number of tanks trying to engage the enemy armor. On the other hand, The Americans used the M3s in smaller units, which made them vulnerable to concentrated Japanese anti-tank fire. The Japanese made several attacks supported by tanks, but were initially unable to break the defensive line. To boost their force, the Japanese brought in some 45,000 reinforcements, and, at the same time, the 4th Tank Regiment was evacuated for further campaigns. The American defenses were finally breached in early April. The M3 tanks were supporting the retreating infantry units while engaging the 7th Tank Regiment. In the following engagement, the 2 tank battalions were lost, and the Japanese even managed to capture a few of them. Operations in the Dutch East Indies. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies was taken with minimal engagement of Japanese armor due to the impassable terrain. The Type 95 did see limited action, mainly in fire support roles. Combat in Burma. The next Japanese target was Burma, for which the 1st, 2nd, and 14th Tank Regiments were assigned to. On the 21st of January, 1942, the Japanese used tanks for the very first time in the region, with great effect against the defending Allied soldiers of the Sitang River. In February, the Allies were reinforced with 2 armored units, the 7th Armored Brigade and the 7th Hussars, equipped with American M3 light tanks. The 2 units were mainly used to support the Allied retreat and occasionally engage the Type 95s. The Allies were even reinforced with the Chinese 200th Mechanized Division, which was equipped with T-26s. It is unknown if these ever engaged the Japanese in combat. The Burma campaign ended in one more Japanese success. While the tanks played a great role, many fell victim to the harsh terrain and lack of spare parts. In North America, it is generally a less known fact that the Japanese, with a few Type 95s, invaded Kiska Island in Alaska. The few Type 95s engaged in this operation belonged to the 11th Tank Regiment. The whole invasion was short-lived, as it lasted only from June 1942 until the American counterattack in August of the same year. Toward Australia, in the following months, the Japanese made a new attack. By late August 1942, they were preparing an invasion of Milne Bay, supported by Type 95s. However, these offensives would be beaten back by the defending Australians, and the Japanese lost a few Type 95s in the process. Combat uses from 1943 to 1945. Despite these early successes, come 1942 to 43, the Type 95 tank was starting to become obsolete. In 1943, the U.S. Marines began to field the M4 Sherman with armor up to 90 millimeters thick and a 75 millimeter main gun, and the Type 95 was simply no match. In addition, American soldiers and Marines also had at their disposal a number of anti-tank weapons, like the 37mm AT guns and bazookas. As the war progressed and the Japanese began to fight a far more defensive campaign in the Pacific, the Type 95 began to see action as a defensive weapon on many Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Another example was the island of Biak in May 1944, defended by a group of 6 or 7 Type 95s. These tanks were used in an attempt to dislodge the advancing American soldiers. Initially, 4 Type 95s supported by infantry attacked enemy positions, but the Americans were supported by 2 Sherman tanks, and the Shermans fired using armor-piercing rounds, which at first glance did not appear to do any damage. In reality, these simply passed through the Japanese armor, straight through one end and straight out the other side. So, the American tank crews changed to using high explosive rounds, with better results. All 4 Type 95s were lost, despite managing to hit the Shermans without any real damage being taken. A second wave with the remaining Type 95s followed soon, with the same result. On the island of Eniwetok, several Type 95s were dug in and used as static coast bunkers. While they were very successful in holding back the Allied infantry, once the Sherman tanks landed, it was game over for them. A very interesting engagement occurred during the fighting of Betio Island, between a Sherman M4A2 and a Type 95. The lone Type 95 managed to hit a Sherman several times, damaging its gun and turret traverse. The Sherman commander, understandably miffed about the situation, decided to simply ram the Japanese tank, destroying it in the process. One of the last engagements of the Type 95 was during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August of 1945. The Soviets amassed a vast armored formation of some 5,000 vehicles. Meanwhile, the Japanese armored force consisted of only several hundred vehicles of various types. The engagements with Japanese armored vehicles were rare, and most were simply captured by the Soviets. The Type 95 in particular saw combat during the defense of Shimushu Island in August of 1945, where the 11th Tank Regiment was stationed. Some 25 Type 95s and 39 Type 97s tried to push back the Soviet amphibious landing forces. In the following battle, that lasted some 2 hours, the Japanese lost 21 tanks. A few days later, the defending garrison finally surrendered to the Soviets. This battle marked the end of the Japanese armored operations of the war. Use by other nations. Service in Thailand. Contrary to popular belief, the service of the Hago did not end with the defeat of Imperial Japan. The army of Thailand, which had effectively been press-ganged into supporting the Japanese Empire, purchased around 50 Hagos in the early 1940s. There, they were operated under the designation Type 83. Remarkably, after the end of the war, the Thai Army kept their Type 95s in service until 1954. What is even more remarkable is that one of these is technically still in service with the Thai Army. It is kept as a show vehicle and is fully operational, making it one of only a very small number of running vehicles around the world. French service. Reclaiming control of the Far Eastern colonies after the war, the French military took control of whatever Japanese vehicles were still operational. In French Indochina, this consisted of a few Type 95 tanks. Not much is known of them, barring a few photographs. These show some additional 10mm armor plates added to the turret. The vehicles were apparently in operation until the late 1940s, around 1948, although the decisive Viet Minh victory in 1949 would ensure that the French were no longer able to use them in Indochina. Chinese and North Korean service. China operated a number of Type 95s which were captured during the war, or were supplied by the Soviets. By 1949, the Chinese had over 300 Japanese vehicles, including some Type 95s, mostly supplied again by the Russians. The North Korean People's Army also used smaller numbers of them, mainly for training. Modifications of the Type 95. During the war, the Japanese tried to improve or reuse the tank for a number of modifications, including an amphibious tank, a version armed with 37 to 57mm caliber guns, self-propelled artillery, and an anti-tank vehicle. First off, the Type 2, Kami. In the early 1940s, the Japanese Imperial Army showed interest in the development of amphibious tanks. During the war, based on the modified Type 95 chassis, the Japanese developed the Type 2 Kami amphibious tank. While it proved to be a good design, only less than 200 would be built during the war. Type 3 Ki-Ri. In an attempt to increase the firepower of support operations, the Type 95 was rearmed with the 57mm Type 90 gun. While the 57mm could fire a more potent high-explosive round than the old 37, it could also fire heat rounds. However, the installation of this gun on the Type 95 turret proved to be quite problematic, and only a few of this version were built. According to A.M. Tomzik, Japanese Armor Volume 9, it was actually equipped with a 37 or 47mm gun placed in a newly designed turret. Sadly, there is no more information about it. So sad. Type 4 Ki-Nu. The Type 4 Ki-Nu was another attempt to rearm the Type 95 with a bigger gun, again a 57mm. In order to accommodate this gun, a larger turret was taken from the Chiha and was used for this modification. As the Type 97 Chiha was being rearmed with a newer 47mm gun, there were plenty of older 57mm and turrets available. The production run was limited, and precise numbers are not clear in their sources. These vehicles were used against the Soviets at the end of the war in 1945. Type 95 Ho-Ru. The Type 95 chassis was used for the experimental Type 5 Ho-Ru anti-tank version. On the chassis, what appears to be a fully enclosed superstructure was added. The main argument was changed to the standard 47mm AT gun. As the work on this project began in 1945, it is not clear if a working prototype was ever built. Type 4 Ho-To. Little is known about this vehicle. The Type 4 Ho-To was built using the chassis of the Type 95 by mounting a new open-top superstructure. The main armament consisted of a 120mm howitzer. While there is photographic evidence that showed a single prototype, there is no information on any of the vehicles being built. So-To. In 1940, a modified Type 45 chassis was extended by an additional road wheel and changed the position of the rear idler. Additional changes were the removal of large parts of the superstructure and replacing it with a 37mm Type 94 infantry and anti-tank gun on its wheel carriage. The whole position machine gun was retained. It is not clear in these sources if this version was built in any number or if it remained only a prototype. This vehicle received the So-To designation, which can be translated as Carrier 7. Post-war modifications. Like many Second World War vehicles, a number of surviving Ha-Gos will be modified for use in civilian and police services. While there is little information on these conversions, the civilian version had the superstructure and the turret removed and replaced with a single enclosed cabin. It was also equipped with a dozer blade. The police version received an enlarged, cube-shaped superstructure. Surviving vehicles. Being one of the most numerously built Japanese tanks, it is not surprising to see that some vehicles are still around. There are at least several in Russia, of which one is in running condition. Several more are located in Thailand, with the aforementioned running tank. A number of wrecks can also be seen throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Some can also be seen in the US, Australia, and UK as museum pieces. Conclusion. In the West, the Japanese tanks have never received much respect or admiration. Since the island-hopping campaign of the Pacific War, they have been often dismissed as poor tanks with thin armor and weak firepower. This assessment may be considered harsh and also a bit unwarranted. For, in considering the Ha-Go, it must be remembered that this was an early 1930s design aimed at supporting infantry during the Sino-Japanese War. In this theater, it was extremely effective, as it was facing an enemy without large tank force or a significant number of AT guns. It was only later, during the Pacific War in the mid-1940s, when these tanks faced a much bigger and tougher enemy tank, such as the American M4 Sherman. The Ha-Go and many of its Japanese contemporaries suffered greatly at the hands of the superior Sherman, which outclassed the Ha-Go in every respect. The Type 95 was one of Imperial Japan's most produced tanks. By 1943, some 2,300 of these bad boys were built, and they were reliable too, and well liked by their crews. Their small size making them ideal for urban and jungle warfare. They would serve until the end of the Second World War, for Japan at least, and through the colds of northern China, the humid jungles of Burma, and the scorching sun-baked islands of the Pacific, the Ha-Go was always there to fight for the Emperor. Well, that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit a like button and subscribe button and the bell button. And yeah, we got all the social medias, so you can follow us on all the social medias. And we also have a Discord server, so you can find us there. So that way you can watch our videos and talk about us with our videos, and click on the YouTube feedback section, which is where I browse a lot. Yeah, if you'd like to help us continue to develop and expand, please consider donating on Patreon. All of the funds will go to creating new articles and features for you. I'm Jim Zawacki, and this article was written by Marco P. and Mark Nash. I don't know who the audio editor is because I haven't sent it to them yet. I don't know who video edited it either. But until then, I'm your boy, Jim Zawacki, and keep us in your sights. I did it!